everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's episode of Can You Repeat That podcast. We're your hosts. My name is Leslie.
My name's Chantelle.
And I am Atlas.
Before I hand this over to Atlas, I just wanted to take a minute to say thank you to everybody who has been listening, downloading our episodes, rating and reviewing the podcast, and giving us some grace while we figure out all of the things going on. So, anything else I need to add to this, guys?
No, I don't think so. Sounds good.
All right, the stage is yours, Atlas.
Thank you, Leslie. We're going to depart a little bit from the paranormal today, like the last couple episodes have been, and focus more on kind of a weird event in history. But to start off with a quick question. What would you say is the weirdest thing to fight over? And when I say fight, I don't mean an argument. I mean like an actual war where people die.
A pencil?
A pencil. A pencil is good, but how about a bucket?
Oh.
So what I'm going to talk today about is an event in history. It occurred in 1325 called literally the War of the Bucket. You didn't come here for a history lesson, but just to kind of understand the setting going into this, I have to give a little bit of background of what happened and what led up to this event. So the War of the Oaken Bucket, as I said, occurred in 1325 in what is now modern-day Italy. At the time, Italy wasn't really a nation as we know it today, not really with unified borders. Since the fall of the Roman Empire, Italy was not united. After the collapse, there was this massive power vacuum that formed on the Italian peninsula, and it allowed for mostly powerful city-states to form and take power. So instead of having Italy as we know it, you had a bunch of cities that controlled regions, princedoms, kingdoms, all of which were governed independently and had their own traditions, languages, cultures, and politics. So given these differences, it wasn't really unusual for the Italian provinces to come into conflict with each other. One of the biggest players, of course, was the Papal States, which was controlled by, as the name would suggest, the Pope. And at this time, you might have heard of like Christendom and the control that the Catholic Church had over Europe. And this was really true at this time, especially. The popes were as much kings as they were religious leaders, and you may see a problem with that already.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of held on to that power for quite some time. To kind of give you some context, the Papal States were not dissolved, and the Italian borders as they are today were not established until 1870.
Oh, wow.
To throw that into a little bit more context, the nation of Canada, as we know it today, was recognized on July 1st, 1867. The USA declared their independence in July of 1776 and had a civil war in the 1860s. Mexico declared their independence in 1821, was recognized internationally as a nation in 1836, and had gone through 3 constitutions by 1868. So, in other words, the entire continent of North America as we know it today got its shit together before Italy was finally a unified nation.
You could say they were in no rush.
So as you can imagine, there was some significant infighting over the years. This was made kind of worse at the formation of a kingdom to the north of Italy called the Holy Roman Empire, which despite its name was not holy, not Roman, and not an empire. It was originally a kingdom that was founded by the Frankish or French king Charlemagne, and he was elected as the inheritor of the Roman state by the popes. And the original intention was for the popes to kind of use them as a bludgeon against the rest of Europe. And they'd run into some problems on this later on. But the Holy Roman Empire itself was really more like the Italian peninsula, this whole collection of princedoms and kingdoms and cities that at least outwardly feigned allegiance to their emperor, but they weren't really united. At least not at first, but they started to kind of get their shit together and become more unified and become an empire in name. And then they kind of started to push back against the popes that created them. And this is where we started to run into some problems, which would lead up to the war that we're going to talk about today. The biggest of these happened in 1076, and it was known as the investiture controversy. Basically, the Pope claimed the right to elect kings, thereby placing themselves above kings as quote-unquote God's anointed representative on earth. Well, the Holy Roman Emperors started to get it into their heads that, wait a minute, if I'm holy and the representative of God, and if I'm the inheritor of Rome, why am I listening to somebody else? Understandable. And this came to a head in 1154 when the current Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa suddenly was like, wait a minute, I'm the Roman Emperor. Why am I not ruling in Rome and why is the Pope?
Valid question.
You tell someone they're emperor long enough, eventually one of them starts to believe it. The popes pushed back. So obviously, the statement of independence that the emperor deciding that, well, if he was the Holy Roman Emperor, then he was God's representative and not the Pope. And the Pope had a little bit of a problem with this, and attempted to excommunicate Frederick Barbarossa. Excommunicate meaning not only throw out of the Catholic Church, but your soul was damned after death automatically, is what the process of excommunication
Spicy.
supposed. Spicy. Barbarossa's response was pretty swift. He invaded Italy, and took over the towns of Milan, Tortona, Pavia, and Tuscany. They fought for a little bit. Eventually, peace talks led to something of a armistice between the Holy Roman Empire and the Pope, but the relationship was never the same. And Barbarossa's little parting gift to Italy was a major political rift that would keep the city-states there feuding with each other for centuries. And it was this rift that sparked the bizarre War of the Bucket in 1325. Barbarossa's siege may have been over, and the Holy Roman Empire and the Pope may have been quote unquote at peace, but conflict was definitely alive and well in northern Italy. And two factions emerged from the aftermath of the war: the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. A little bit of weird names, but we'll go into those just a minute here. The Guelphs were the supporters of the Pope. They were cities that feared the expansion of the empire to the north. They supported the power of the Pope, not only in Italy, but in Europe and the world in general as God's representative. Okay, kiss ups, the teacher's pets. And then the Ghibellines were the supporters of the Holy Roman Empire. They were afraid of the universal and absolute power that the popes had held over both church and state. I know, weird, right? Totally crazy. Who would fear that? It never went badly. Um, these two factions would sometimes control entire cities. They'd make up like the government structure of it. People who were part of those factions would get into power, or sometimes cities were contested between the two factions, and you'd have both of those factions present within a city, and the city itself would be a hotbed of political intrigue and infighting. Interesting little side note: the Guelphs and the Ghibellines were later on known as the Montecchi and the Capellini, or if you anglicize those names, the Montagues and the Capulets.
Oh, like
And if
Romeo
you
and Juliet.
recognize exactly, you know your Shakespeare. Um,
Mm.
in fact, the events of just as a side note, the events of Romeo and Juliet are thought to have been based on actual events that occurred in the city of Siena, Italy, which was largely a Ghibelline city. So if you ever read Romeo and Juliet and wondered why are Romeo and Tibulette killing each other over a couple words in the street, well, because they're
Mm.
representative of a larger conflict that was going on across multiple different nations at the time, and their families were literally blood enemies. But two of these such cities, and as we get into the actual topic of today's podcast and talk, were the cities of Bologna and Modena, who were two such of these bordering city states that had their own regions and were on definite opposite sides of the political spectrum. Bologna was a Pope supporting city. They were controlled by the Guelphs, and Modena was an imperial city supporting the Holy Roman Empire. That they were already before the invasion of Italy by Frederick Barbarossa. They already hated each other. There was already a lot of rivalry going on, and adding a socio-political religious conflict on top of it really didn't do much to help that rivalry. They had a significant number of fights and bickering over centuries, but in 1325, tensions finally boiled over. Leading up to that, it wasn't uncommon for soldiers from Modena or from Bologna to raid villages on each other's side, maybe take a castle or two, spit at each other as they passed on the road. It was just, all good fun and games. But one night in 1325, several soldiers from Modena not only raided the city of Bologna itself, but got inside the walls. On their way out, while they were being chased, they spotted a bucket at a public well, and according to sources, seized it and ran through the cities toward the closest gate. And then they began to scream, according to some sources, "Rubato il secchio, we have taken your bucket." So rubbing it in as they began to run.
You'd think they would have grabbed something more valuable and not just a bucket?
Well, they did take some valuables too, but for some reason, according to the sources, which I'll cite at the end, it was the bucket that they were the most brazen about. Why? Don't know. Um, but they did escape, and they took the bucket back with them to Modena. Obviously, with the taunting and with their enemy being within the city walls themselves, the Bolognese were infuriated. And they chose a rather weird hill to die upon, and it wasn't that soldiers got into their city, it was that their bucket was taken. The Bolognese leaders sent a message to Modena demanding the return of the bucket and an apology for stealing it, not for invading their city, for stealing a bucket from their city. Modena did not really agree to this demand. They were not amenable to peace. And not only did they send back a refusal, but according to sources, the refusal contained a taunt. It doesn't translate well from Italian to English, but more or less, if you can't protect a bucket, how can you protect a city? Was basically the implication.
I mean, there's a valid point there, I guess.
There is a valid point there. If you can't protect the, but a little bucket of wood and iron is kind of a weird hill to die upon. But here we are. Um, Incensed and humiliated, Bologna declared war on Modena, and with that, the War of the Bucket commenced. Between the two cities, Modena, the aggressors in this case, the bucket stealers, those rapscallions, were considered the underdog. Their city was smaller, they had fewer resources at their disposal, and Bologna also had a trump card that they immediately played, and they called the Pope for backup. Now, one might think that any rational person would be like, "You're fighting over a what?" and then ignore any further correspondence. But no, no. The Pope at the time, John the 22nd, was more than happy to involve himself in this little affair along the border. Not only did he declare Modena's leadership and magistrates heretics, blasphemers, and then excommunicate them, he raised an army of over 30,000 soldiers and personally led them to Bologna to fight against Modena.
Over a bucket.
Over a bucket. Some 30,000 infantry and some 2,000 heavy cavalry, led, as I said, by the Pope himself. To come up against this, Modena was able to gather about 7 to 8,000 soldiers, depending on the source that you read. Now, on the surface, this looks as if you're doomed. You're completely outnumbered, and, well, you're doomed in the first place because you're fighting over a stupid bucket. Uh, but a miserable defeat would be the first thing that people would expect, but Modena had an advantage. The majority of the Pope's army was mostly untrained militia and draftees, basically peasants who had been given a spear and a shield and told, stand in line and stab things. The Holy Roman Empire had spent years building up their military, and Modena had access to German soldiers and mercenaries who were professionally trained and very well equipped. So even though they were outnumbered, they had a distinct advantage in the quality of the soldiers they had, so much so that they were confident enough to meet an army much larger than themselves in the open field, and that's exactly what they did. And that led to the one and only battle of the War of the Bucket, which happened outside a town called Zappolino. It was a small village about equidistance between Modena and Bologna. Um, the sources of the battle are a little bit unclear as to how precisely Bologna got their butts handed to them, but it was the outcome. Complete chaos and disorganization overtook the Bolognian ranks, and Modena completely overwhelmed them and drove them from the field. Casualty estimates on the side of Modena, the heavily outnumbered one, are about 3 to 500, while on the side of Bologna were anywhere between 2.5 to 6,000.
I just can't wrap my head around that much death over a bucket.
Over a bucket, right? But we weren't done. We're not done. The Modenese were not done. They were not content to simply defeat the Bolognese on the battlefield, and they pursued them all the way back to and into the walls of Bologna, where then the Bolognese dug in and prepared for a siege. The Modenese cut off their city and didn't start a siege of their own. Instead, they staged a mock decathlon outside of the city where they reenacted the theft of the bucket.
Oh, no.
I aspire to be this petty one day.
They then took the bucket back home because they didn't have the resources to carry on a siege. They didn't have the manpower to do so, nor the equipment. So they took the bucket back and they displayed it up in the bell tower of their cathedral, the Torre della Ghirlandia. Sorry, Ghirlandina, just to extra rub it in their face. And once again, they also then reenacted the theft of the bucket. Eventually, after about a year or so, the fight did fizzle out. The Battle of Zappolino was really the only large conflict. There were some minor skirmishes, and in January of 1326, an armistice was signed by the two rivals that temporarily settled their matters. There was honestly too much conflict and bad blood at this point to completely abate them, and they'd have their on and off fights for another 2 centuries or so. It was really only an outside invasion by Charles I of Spain in 1529 that the two factions finally put their hatchet completely to rest and unified. Um, Despite some requests for it, Modena never returned the bucket to Bologna. It remained displayed in their bell tower of their cathedral for years. What is said to be the original bucket is still on display in the Comunal Museum to this day, and there is a replica that now hangs in the bell tower. We will post a picture. And even now, 700 years later, it's become kind of a source of, some ribbing, playful dispute. Every so often, there'll be a reenactment that takes place. As I said, you can still see what's said to be the original bucket and the replica to this day. But yeah, just a fun little, odd little thing in history. Not really the hill you'd expect to die on, but it's the hill they chose. Obviously, not. The war wasn't really over a bucket, but it was a funny little straw that broke the camel's back, and it's always been an interesting story that I've found a lot of amusement in.
Can you remind me, what was this bucket made out of?
Oak, by all accounts, oak and bound with iron.
Can you imagine having so little to do you go to war for a bucket?
It's kind of an odd thing to choose. They always say choose your battles. That wouldn't be the one that I would choose personally, but what do I know?
I would have loved to know the thought process. Let's steal this bucket. We're going to start a war all for this bucket.
Well, no, you don't know. I don't either. I actually I can't wrap my mind around it. It's amusing, but every time I hear about it again or we brought up or talk about it, my mind always at the end is just like a bucket. Okay. What can you say really to that? You're willing to kill thousands of people, and what's the trigger point? They stole your bucket. Well, they taunted me too.
I really have no words. They must have had so much time, and I'm shocked to learn that the bucket has survived fires, a whole war, and whatever else it may have survived.
It's hard to say whether the one that's left is in fact the bucket of the legend, but I like to think it is.
Yeah, but it makes it more fun.
It does.
At least it's like, well, it survived however many years, so it was worth stealing.
I mean, 700 years is a good lifespan for a bucket. But
Yeah.
our sources today come from two sources. One is La battaglia di Zappolino e la secchia rapita, which is the Battle of Zappolino and the kidnapped bucket. And the Conflictus Zapolini, Memoriale, historicum de rebus, bononiensium, si anno 1325, or the Battle of Zappolini, and the accounts or the events of the history of Bologna in 1325. Google Translate has a very good English to Latin translator if you'd like to try to read them.
That was a good story. Thank you very much, Atlas.
Anytime.
Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. As always, you can find any pictures pertaining to this story posted on Instagram and Twitter at CYRTpod. Be sure to rate and review us wherever you listen. Have a topic or suggestion, or you want to share your story, send us an email at cyrtpod@gmail.com. Until next time, happy listening.
I turned the noise reduction down to about 15 decibels instead of 30 to see if that eliminates the echo that I keep hearing. Okay, so far I think this is the best sound, so I'm going to make sure that this is saved, so anytime that we record I can make sure I'm selected on this and not something else that makes me sound like a weird alien.